My son didn't come to his mother's funeral. While I stood at her grave with a single rose in my hand, he was posing for photos at the airport before his flight with his wife. I stayed silent, but fate had other plans. As he prepared for his vacation, surrounded by loud announcements and the laughter of passengers, he was caught by a voice he never expected to hear again. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Raymond Harper. I was 78 years old the day I buried my wife. For over 4 decades, I worked as a school bus mechanic in Springfield, Illinois. My hands had known the insides of engines better than they had known the softness of most things. I spent my life tightening bolts, checking brake lines, and crawling under machines that carried other people's children to and from lives that had nothing to do with mine. It was honest work. It made my back ache and my knees crack, but it was steady, and it gave me the sense that I was useful, that I was needed. But on the day they lowered her casket into the ground, there was no sense of usefulness left in me. The funeral was small, quiet, the kind of quiet that sinks into your clothes and stays there long after you've gone home. The wind was sharp, not with cold, but with the kind of edge that seems to slice right through you, as if it knows exactly where your softest parts are. I held a single white rose in my hand. I don't know why I chose white. Maybe because she always said white flowers didn't beg for attention. Maybe because it reminded me of the lace trim she liked on her pillowcases. Or maybe because it was the only color that felt honest that day. There weren't many people. A couple of neighbors, a woman from the grocery store, one of the nurses from the clinic. I stood by the grave and listened to the minister read from a folded sheet of paper, his voice flat and distant, like a radio station just out of range. But I wasn't really listening. I was watching the space beside me, the space that should have held my son. It was empty. Benjamin didn't come. 2 days before the funeral, he called me from the airport, said he and his wife had already planned a trip, a resort somewhere down in Florida. He used words like non-refundable and prepaid. His voice was even and polite, the same tone you might use to cancel a dentist appointment. I said I understood. I don't remember if he asked how I was doing. I don't think he did. I hung up the phone, and then I sat at the kitchen table for almost an hour, without moving. I didn't tell anyone he wasn't coming. I didn't want to watch their reactions. I didn't want the headshakes or the soft, pitying noises people make when they think your pain needs a soundtrack. When the ceremony ended, I stayed behind. I waited until everyone else had wandered off, until even the groundskeepers had moved on to their next task. I stood there with that rose, watching the last mound of earth settle like a blanket over the casket. There was something final in the way the soil sighed when it landed. I knelt down, something my knees hadn't liked me doing in years, and I placed the rose gently on the top. My fingers lingered, as if pressing it into place would keep me tethered to her just a little longer. When I finally rose and walked away, I felt heavier than I had ever felt before. I didn't go home right away. I walked. I didn't care where. The streets were familiar, but I couldn't focus on anything. Cars passed, people laughed, dogs barked, but it all sounded like it was happening in another world. I walked until my legs ached and the wind started to bite through my coat. And then I turned back toward the house we had shared for almost 50 years. The house was silent when I entered. Not just quiet, silent. There's a difference. Quiet is what you get when someone steps out to run an errand. Silence is what remains when they are never coming back. Her slippers were still beneath the bed. I hadn't moved them. I hadn't moved much of anything. Her cardigan still hung on the hook by the back door. The tea tin she loved still sat on the counter. I hadn't opened it. I couldn't bring myself to. Her scent still clung to the fabric of the curtains, to the cushion on her chair, to the pillow on her side of the bed. I hadn't touched that side of the bed. I slept curled up against the edge of mine, as far as I could get from the void beside me. That night, I made tea and poured 2 cups out of habit. I stood there staring at them, steam rising from both mugs like ghosts in the dim kitchen light. I dumped hers down the sink and took mine to the table, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it. I just sat, staring at the empty chair across from me, remembering how she used to sit with her hands wrapped around the mug, thumbs tracing little circles on the rim, like she was warming her thoughts before she spoke them aloud. I went to bed early. I didn't sleep. I lay there, eyes open in the dark, listening to the creaks and clicks of the house. Every sound seemed amplified now. The refrigerator kicking on, the wind brushing past the gutters, the faint ticking of the wall clock in the hallway. It all sounded like a language I could almost understand. I thought about Benjamin, about how he used to climb into our bed on stormy nights, clutching a stuffed bear and hiding his face in her neck. How she would hum to him, never words, just a soft melody that sounded like safety. I wondered if he remembered any of that. I wondered if he cared. I wondered if his new life, his new wife, his new priorities had pushed all of that into some corner of his mind where it didn't ache to be ignored. The next morning, I got up with the sun. I dressed slowly, my fingers stiff and reluctant. I poured myself another cup of tea. I sat at the table again, and once again, the chair across from me remained empty. I walked out to the mailbox and found nothing worth reading. Flyers, a bill, a pre-approved credit card offer. No letter, no message, nothing from Benjamin, nothing to suggest he had even remembered what day it was. Later that afternoon, I returned to the cemetery. I stood by her grave again, this time with no rose. I didn't say anything. I just stood there. The cold seeped into my shoes, but I didn't move. I watched the wind shift the dry grass. A few brown leaves tumbled across the ground like they were chasing something they'd never catch. As I turned to leave, I looked at the empty space beside her headstone. My name was already carved there, beneath hers. All it needed now was a date. I stared at it for a long time, not with fear, not with longing, just with the quiet acknowledgement that the world had shifted, and I was now walking on different ground. Benjamin wasn't there to feel it, but I was. I carried the weight of her absence in my bones, and the silence of his absence in my chest. And somehow, that silence was louder. The chair by the window remained where it had always been. It faced east, catching the morning light when the sun rose above the Petersons' old shed across the road. My wife used to say it was her favorite part of the house, that sliver of sunlight stretching across the hardwood and crawling up her feet like a warm cat. It was an old chair, bought second-hand in 1979 from a yard sale 2 blocks down, but she had loved it, like a friend. Its wooden arms were worn to a soft polish by her hands, and the seat cushion was slightly flattened on the left side, where she always sat leaning. That chair had shaped itself to her body, and now, in her absence, it seemed to sag with grief. Every morning, I walked past it on my way to the kitchen. I never looked at it for long, but I always felt it, like a cold spot in the room, like the ghost of someone who hadn't left all the way. Sometimes I imagined I could still hear the subtle creak it made when she shifted her weight, the light tap of her slipper against the floor, the gentle sigh she'd let out before opening the newspaper. She always read the obituaries first, not out of morbid curiosity, she'd say, but because it reminded her to be grateful. Now I understood what she meant. After she died, I moved nothing. The pillow with its knitted cover, gray with a red thread she stitched in herself, still lay exactly where she'd left it. There was a ring-shaped impression on the end table from her tea mug. She never used coasters. I never minded. The small stack of crossword puzzle books sat next to a half-finished scarf draped over the chair's back. She had been knitting it for no one in particular, just something to do with her hands. A dusty ball of green yarn sat in a shallow bowl beside it, with the needle still looped through the last stitch, paused mid-thought. That chair became the center of the house after she was gone, not because it held anything new, but because it held what used to be. I avoided sitting in it, not out of reverence, but because I didn't trust myself. I was afraid of how it might feel. I didn't want to sink into her warmth and realize how cold it had become. The second morning after the funeral, I brought my coffee into the living room and stood near the chair. I didn't sit. I just stood, staring at it while the mug grew warm in my hand. The sun had risen just enough to cast that familiar golden stripe across the floor. It reached the legs of the chair, then slowly climbed up the cushion. I watched it move like a slow wave across the room, and I thought about all the mornings she sat there with that light across her face, her hair pulled back, her eyes still soft with sleep. She always looked the same in the mornings, not younger, not older, just still, like the world hadn't gotten to her yet. I used to take that for granted, thinking it was just routine, just the rhythm of marriage. But now, standing there with the air too quiet and the chair too empty, I realized that what I'd lost was more than her voice, her touch, or her breath. I'd lost the witness to my life, the one who saw me before the day began, before I put on the mask of civility and purpose. I placed my mug on the end table and stepped back. The sound of ceramic on wood startled me. Even the smallest noises had become louder. Every click of a light switch, every sigh of the radiator, every floorboard's groan, they all seemed to ask the same question. What now? The television sat silent in the corner. I hadn't turned it on in days. The remote sat dusty under a stack of mail. I couldn't bring myself to watch anything. Everything felt false. Laughter, drama, commercials selling medication for ailments I already had. All of it felt like it was meant for someone else, someone still part of the world. I felt like I'd been moved into a different plane, still in the house, still breathing, but not quite real. That afternoon, I tried to sweep the front porch. The wind kept blowing the leaves back at my feet. After 10 minutes, I gave up and leaned against the railing. From there, I could see the outline of the chair through the living room window. It looked different from outside, smaller, lonelier, like a single shoe lost on the side of the road. I thought about going inside and moving it, turning it to face the wall or dragging it into the guest room. But I couldn't. I was afraid the room would lose whatever warmth it still had, even if that warmth was just memory. Later that night, I tried to read in the kitchen, but my eyes kept drifting toward the living room. The chair sat in darkness now, just a darker shape among shadows. I couldn't see the details anymore, but I knew them by heart. The faint water stain on the left leg, the place where the varnish had worn off the right armrest, the fray in the cushion seam where her wedding ring used to catch. I took my book and set it down on the table without turning a single page. I stood up and walked to the doorway, just far enough to look in. There it was. Still. Waiting. Not for me, but for someone who would never return. I considered speaking to it, whispering something into the room like she might hear it through the walls of whatever came after. But I stayed silent. I had spoken to her every day for 53 years. Now it was time to listen. I turned out the lights and went upstairs. The next morning, I did the same thing, walked past the chair without touching it. I boiled water, made tea, sat alone, read the same paragraph of the paper 3 times. I wondered if she ever knew how much I noticed, how her absence wasn't just the silence in the room, but the absence of weight in the chair, the coolness of the seat, the unbroken pattern in the cushion. By the 4th day, I began to talk to her, not aloud, just in my head. I told her about the grocery store, about the weather, about the bill I forgot to pay. I told her about how the cat from next door had started sitting on our porch like he owned it. I imagined her voice responding, not with words, but with the sound of her breath, her laughter, the rustle of her turning the page of her book. I didn't sit in the chair. Not that day. Not for a long time. I kept it there, exactly as it was, because part of me believed that as long as it remained untouched, she hadn't completely left. As long as that chair held her shape, I could pretend that the world was just on pause, that maybe tomorrow she'd return to fill it again, cross her legs, and look up at me like nothing had changed. But everything had. And that chair knew it. It began slowly, as most things do when you're grieving. At first, I thought it was the usual creaking of old wood, the familiar groan of a house built in the 50s, tired joints adjusting to the seasons. But over time, I began to notice something different, something more deliberate. The sounds weren't random anymore. They had rhythm, pattern. And when I sat alone long enough, with the television off and no traffic passing on the street outside, I could swear I heard her voice in the walls. Not words, not whispers, but the distinct shape of her presence. There were certain places in the house where it was strongest. The corner of the hallway by the linen closet, the spot beside the fridge where she used to hum while unpacking groceries, the foot of the stairs, right where she used to pause and call up to me. It didn't feel imagined. It didn't feel like a memory. It felt near. I spent more time in those places without realizing it. I'd lean against the wall near the laundry room just to listen. The radiator would click, and something in that hollow metal rhythm would strike a chord that reminded me of her laugh. Sometimes, when I was halfway up the stairs, I'd pause, not from exhaustion, but because I thought I heard the floorboard behind me groan the way it used to when she'd follow me with a folded blanket in her arms. I'd stand still, waiting for nothing, knowing full well no one was coming, and yet, hoping. The kitchen sink had always had a slow drip. She used to scold me for never fixing it. Now I'd lie awake at night and listen to it, counting the drops like syllables in a forgotten language. At some point I realized I was waiting for it to stop, not because I wanted silence, but because I feared silence more than I feared anything else. The drip meant the house was still talking. The house remembered her. One night, I found myself sitting in the hallway with the lights off, my back against the wall. I had gone to get a towel from the closet and never made it to the bathroom. I just lowered myself down and stayed there. The air was heavy, filled with something invisible, but palpable. I closed my eyes and let it wrap around me, like the weight of a warm coat. I stayed there until my legs went numb and the cold crept into my knees. And even then, I didn't move. I didn't want to break the spell. I didn't want to admit it was all just in my head. I started opening drawers she hadn't touched in years, not because I needed anything from them, but because they smelled like her. Old receipts, buttons, scraps of fabric, a small bottle of perfume I hadn't seen in decades. I uncapped it and closed my eyes, and suddenly I was standing beside her on a Sunday morning, watching her apply it to her wrists with that quiet, practiced grace. I kept the bottle open that day, letting the scent drift through the house, hoping it might coax her voice back out of the walls. I found an old cassette recorder in the attic one afternoon while looking for the box of tax documents. It was buried under a pile of tangled extension cords and Christmas lights that hadn't been untangled in 10 years. The plastic was brittle, the buttons stiff, but it still worked. There was even a tape inside, one of those cheap black cassettes with a torn label. I pressed play, not expecting much. Static at first, then a pause, then her voice, soft, tentative, singing to herself. Just a few bars of a lullaby she used to hum without knowing it. The sound was warped, distant, but unmistakable. I didn't know when she'd recorded it. I didn't remember ever hearing it before. But there it was, her voice, trapped in magnetic tape, living in plastic, proof that she had existed in this house not just in memory, but in sound. I played it again, and again. I carried the recorder with me from room to room, pressing play wherever the walls felt emptiest. At some point, I started talking back. Not aloud, not in any dramatic way, just soft acknowledgments, small thoughts under my breath. I'd walk into a room and say her name, not expecting a response, just needing the rhythm of it in the air. I'd whisper small observations about the weather, the leaves falling too early this year, the neighbors arguing again over their dog. I spoke to her the way I might speak to someone in another room, separated by a thin wall. I began to believe that maybe that's all death really was. The phone rang one afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. It was Benjamin, calling from somewhere on the road. He said they were headed to a beach town, something about needing rest, a break from all the heaviness of the last few weeks. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the message with the cassette still playing in the background. Her voice hummed behind his, like a soundtrack to a conversation he didn't know he was having. When the message ended, I didn't call him back. I turned off the answering machine and placed the recorder on the table. I looked out the window at the swing in the backyard. It hadn't moved in days. No wind, no children, just a frozen moment in a life that used to be filled with motion. I imagined her voice there too, calling out through the glass, telling me to come in before the cold set into my bones. I went to the basement that evening, another place thick with the scent of time. I dug through old boxes, searching for more of her. Tapes, letters, photographs, anything that might carry an echo. I found one of her journals, half filled, her handwriting leaning slightly to the left. She wrote about ordinary things, grocery lists, thoughts about the neighbors, a note about how the living room smelled different after the rain. Her words read like whispers. I held the journal close to my chest and closed my eyes, listening. The house had changed. Or maybe I had. Maybe grief rearranged the architecture of perception, carving doorways in walls that had always been solid. Maybe the dead stayed, not in ghostly shapes or flickering lights, but in the acoustics of the familiar. Maybe every sigh in the ductwork, every knock in the pipes, every shift in the floorboards was a syllable in the language of the afterlife. That night, I left the recorder on the windowsill. I pressed play and let her voice sing to the empty room. I sat in the hallway again, in the dark, and waited for the walls to speak. They did. Not with words, but with presence. The attic had always been her territory, not mine. I'd avoided it for years, partly because the narrow stairs creaked like brittle bones, and partly because the space above felt like a sealed vault of a life I wasn't yet ready to open. She was the one who kept it in order, who labeled the boxes in her tight cursive, who knew what sat where beneath the cobwebs and insulation. I rarely went up there, unless she asked me to carry something. But one morning, a week or so after the funeral, I found myself staring at the ceiling hatch in the hallway, the pull string swaying ever so slightly, like it had been waiting for me. I don't know what compelled me to climb those steps that day. Maybe it was the silence downstairs, the way it clung too tightly to my shoulders. Maybe it was her voice echoing through the walls, pushing me upward toward something unresolved. Or maybe I simply wanted to feel close to her, in a place where time had been frozen under dust and cardboard. The attic was dim and smelled of dry wood and old paper. A single bulb hung from the center beam, casting a yellowish light that didn't quite reach the corners. I moved slowly, careful not to knock over stacks of boxes or trip over loose insulation. The floorboards bowed slightly under my weight, groaning in protest. I crouched and opened the first box I recognized. Holiday Decor, written in her handwriting with a green Sharpie that had faded into gray. Inside were old ornaments, some wrapped in newspaper from the late 80s. I found the glass angel she had insisted on putting on the top of the tree every year, no matter how wobbly it made the branches. I held it up to the light. One wing was chipped. She used to say it made the angel more human. I moved through the boxes one at a time. Each one was a capsule, a sliver of a season we had lived through and forgotten. There was a box full of scarves she'd knitted over the years, labeled extra warm. I didn't know who they were for. Some still had tags. Another held my son's old school papers, drawings of dinosaurs and fire trucks, with his name written in block letters, each one backward or misshapen. She had saved every single one. I kept going. Eventually, I found the box that stopped me. It was heavier than the others and unlabeled. When I opened it, the scent hit me first. Lavender and something else. Something warm. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, bundled in string. Some were mine, written to her during the early years of our marriage when I worked long hours and left notes on the kitchen table before dawn. Others were from her sister in Ohio, and some from friends I didn't recognize. But beneath them, wrapped in a cloth napkin, was a small leather journal. It was hers. I opened it carefully. The first page had only a date, March 14th, 1983. The handwriting was neat, pressed into the paper with gentle pressure. She had written about our son's 3rd birthday, about the cake she'd made from scratch, about the way he smeared frosting on his cheeks and laughed so hard, he snorted. The entry ended with one sentence that made my chest tighten. I hope he remembers this, even if I'm the one who forgets. I kept reading. Each page was a snapshot, a glimpse of days I had forgotten or never known. She had written about the little things, grocery lists, the smell of autumn, a moment when the cat brought in a dead bird and she cried, not for the bird, but for the sound it made when it hit the floor. She wrote about watching me sleep, about her fear of getting old, about how sometimes, when the house was too quiet, she'd hum just to hear something that came from within. The dust on the box made my hands gray, but I didn't care. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor, knees aching, and read until the bulb above began to flicker. I forgot about time. The air felt still, and for a moment I could believe she was in the room with me, crouched beside me, watching as I uncovered her secret world. At the bottom of the box was an old cassette tape, no label. I held it like a fossil, unsure of its contents. My fingers trembled as I set it aside. I stayed in the attic long after the sun had moved to the other side of the house. Shadows stretched across the floorboards, and the light bulb cast long streaks through the dust that now floated in the air like slow-moving snow. I didn't want to leave. Downstairs was too empty, too clean. Up here, everything still bore her fingerprints. I found a photograph folded between 2 books. It was from our first Christmas in the house. She was sitting on the living room rug, holding our son in her lap, both of them mid-laugh, blurry from movement. My younger self stood awkwardly beside the tree, looking half asleep and unsure of how to hold Joy in his arms. The corners of the photo were worn. She had touched it often. Maybe she kept it close during years when our son had grown distant, when the phone calls became shorter, when holidays were spent with polite obligation. I stared at the photo for a long time. The memory it captured wasn't perfect, but it was real. That night, I brought the journal and the tape downstairs. I placed the tape on the kitchen counter, not ready to listen yet. The journal went beside my bed. I read a page each night, slowly, as though trying to hear her voice in the rhythm of the ink. It wasn't just what she had written. It was how she had written it. The pauses, the loops of her L's, the way her question marks always curled like they were afraid of being too loud. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd found, not that there was anyone to tell. In the weeks that followed, I dusted each box in the attic, labeled them in my own hand. Her letters, his drawings, winter mornings. I made a kind of museum out of our shared years, not because I was clinging to the past, but because the past had started to whisper back. In the attic air, in the weight of those boxes, in the scent of old paper and perfume. I had found something stronger than grief. I had found the memory of love, preserved not in marble or stone, but in dust, and it was enough to carry me. I began walking to the cemetery every morning. It wasn't far, just under 2 miles each way if I followed the sidewalk along Briar Lane and cut through the field behind the old Presbyterian church. I could have driven, but something about the walk made the visit feel more earned. My legs ached most days, and my right foot had a tendency to drag slightly, the result of an old injury I never bothered getting checked out. But I welcomed the discomfort. It made me feel present. It gave the silence a shape. I left the house around 7, always after finishing my tea but before the sun had fully warmed the pavement. The streets were still quiet then. Most folks were either still asleep or already on their way to work. I liked that time, when the town held its breath between night and morning. The shadows stretched longer, and the world moved slower. On the first day, I brought nothing. I stood at her grave with my hands in my coat pockets, watching as a gust of wind fluttered the corners of the small laminated prayer card someone had tucked under the bouquet from the funeral. The flowers were already beginning to wither, their color retreating into muted browns and yellows. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply stood there, the way I used to stand in the garage waiting for the engine oil to drain, patient, silent, letting the weight of time do what it needed to. On the second day, I picked up a small stone from the sidewalk just before the field. It was nothing special. A chipped piece of limestone, the kind the city used for patchwork repairs. I turned it over in my palm a few times as I walked, feeling its coolness, the rough edges pressing into the crease between my fingers. When I reached her grave, I crouched, carefully, slowly, and placed the stone on the flat top of the headstone. That small act felt heavier than it should have, like I was anchoring something, or maybe like I was being anchored. I did the same thing the next day, a different stone, roughly the same size. This one was smoother, darker, flecked with quartz. I placed it beside the first. There was no ceremony to it, just motion, stone on stone. One piece of the world offered to another. It became a ritual. Each morning I selected a new stone, not from the same place. Some I found at the edge of the sidewalk, others from the edge of the creek that cut behind the neighborhood. I never took more than one. I never searched too hard. I let the stones find me. Some days they were flat and circular, like coins from a forgotten country. Other days they were jagged and light, brittle under pressure. I took them all the same. By the end of the second week, there were more than a dozen stones resting atop her grave. I never explained them to anyone. A couple of times, a groundskeeper gave me a curious look, but said nothing. I appreciated that. The world had become too loud with its need for explanation. This quiet act, didn't need defending. The stones gave shape to my grief. Each one held a mourning, a thought, a piece of time I couldn't reclaim. They became markers of my own endurance. I would press them into my palm as I walked, as if asking them to absorb what I couldn't say, and when I placed them on the granite, I imagined them speaking for me. Not in sentences, in presence. Some mornings I found myself talking to her in my head, telling her about what I'd eaten for breakfast, about the strange noise the furnace had started making, about the squirrel that kept digging holes in the front yard. I told her that Benjamin hadn't called, that I hadn't expected him to, that his silence had stopped being a surprise and started becoming part of the landscape. Other mornings, I said nothing. I just sat on the small bench nearby, letting the breeze move around me, carrying with it the faint scent of mowed grass and earth. There was peace in that stillness. It didn't heal. It didn't soothe. But it settled something inside me, like dust finding its way to the floor after a long time suspended in air. One day, a child's voice broke the silence. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8, walked past the graveyard with her mother, pointing to the stones on the headstone. "Why are they all there?" she asked. Her mother hesitated and said, "Some people leave flowers. Some leave stones. It means someone remembers." The words stayed with me. I didn't leave the stones out of tradition. I wasn't Jewish. I didn't grow up with any cultural significance attached to the act. But those stones became my language, my way of saying, "You are not forgotten. You are not gone. You are here, in the weight of this stone, in the callus it leaves on my thumb, in the morning walk I take with no destination but you." I began choosing the stones more deliberately. One morning I picked one with a crack down the middle and thought of it as the shape of absence. Another day I found one with a rust-colored stain and thought of how her lipstick used to leave a smudge on the rim of every cup she used. These were not metaphors. They were memories made tangible. At home, I kept a small notebook. I didn't write in it every day, only when a particular memory surfaced. I logged the date and a short sentence. Blue-gray stone, cold wind, remembered her humming while folding laundry. The entries were sparse, not meant to be read aloud, only felt. The notebook grew heavy with them, like my pocket, like my chest. Some days I forgot why I was walking until I felt the stone in my hand. Then I remembered, not just her, but myself. Who I had been when she was alive, who I was becoming without her. Grief is strange. It doesn't live in the loud sobs or the dramatic gestures. It lives in the repetition, in the way you tie your shoes, in the creak of a door, in the space between a heartbeat and a breath, and in my case, in the weight of a stone resting against my palm as I walked a road that had begun to remember me. Eventually, I ran out of space on the top of the grave. I began placing the newer stones at its base, arranging them in a slow spiral that curled into itself. I never planned it. My hands simply moved that way, as if they knew more than I did, as if they had learned to speak without words. Every stone was a conversation, every placement a sentence. And though she never answered, I kept walking. The refrigerator had become too quiet. There was a time when its low hum was just part of the background, a soft companion to the ticking clock and the radio that played old jazz on Sunday mornings. But lately, I had started noticing it, not because it had grown louder, but because the house had grown so quiet that even its small mechanical breath stood out like a cough in a church pew. I hadn't opened it in days. I wasn't avoiding it exactly. I still drank water, still boiled eggs now and then. But the act of opening the refrigerator had begun to feel like opening a drawer in a room no one lived in anymore. It held more than food. It held echoes. One morning, after my usual walk to the cemetery, I came home and stood in front of the fridge for nearly 5 minutes before pulling the handle. I could feel the cool draft escaping around the seal, like the breath of something forgotten. When I finally opened the door, I was met with the dim yellow light, and a kind of stillness I hadn't expected. Not the calm kind, but the empty kind. The kind that felt like a stopped watch. Inside were the leftovers she had frozen 6 weeks before she died, labeled in her handwriting: beef stew, chicken casserole, lentil soup. Each container perfectly stacked, sealed, dated. She had always done that. She planned meals as if the world might end, and we'd still have to eat. She didn't like waste, didn't trust expiration dates, believed in the practical magic of preparation. I touched one of the containers. The plastic was brittle from cold and time. The ink had smudged a little on the masking tape, but I still recognized her script. Neat, slanted slightly to the right, always in blue pen. I ran my thumb across the word stew and felt an ache in my chest. Not hunger, not sadness, something heavier, regret maybe, or longing, or both, folded into each other like pastry dough. The fridge wasn't completely empty, but it might as well have been. A half-used bottle of mustard, a jar of pickles that hadn't been opened since 4th of July, a Tupperware with something unidentifiable, and now gray. I tossed it in the trash without looking. On the middle shelf sat a single apple, wrinkled, soft at the top. I held it for a moment, then placed it back. I couldn't bring myself to throw it out. She had bought that apple. She had placed it there. It felt like the last breath of her intention. The freezer was worse. It was like opening a time capsule with no instructions. Frozen bags of chopped spinach, 2 boxes of waffles unopened, a wrapped roast covered in frost like snow on a window pane. I stared at it for a while, wondering when she had last planned to cook it, wondering if she knew she wouldn't get the chance. The ice cube tray was empty. I closed the door slowly. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table and tried to make a list of groceries. I wrote down milk, eggs, bread. Then I stopped. What else? I didn't know what I liked. I had spent so many years eating what she cooked, what she thought would be good for me, what she knew I enjoyed, that I didn't know what I wanted on my own. The thought unsettled me. I crossed out the list and left the paper on the table. The next morning, I opened the fridge again. Same contents, same light. I removed one of the frozen meals and set it on the counter. Lentil soup. She had made it from scratch every winter, always adding a little too much cumin. I never told her. I had grown to love it. I placed the container in a pot of warm water to defrost and sat back down at the table. The microwave beeped an hour later. I stood, reheated the soup, poured it into a bowl, and sat again. The steam rose in lazy spirals. I didn't taste it at first. I just let the warmth fill the space between my hands. Then I ate. Slowly. Carefully. Halfway through, I felt tears roll down my face, not because the soup was good or bad, but because it tasted exactly like her. That night, I dreamed of her standing in front of the open refrigerator, arms crossed, trying to decide what to make. In the dream, she turned to me and smiled. Nothing else, just that. I woke up before sunrise with the image still imprinted in my mind like condensation on glass. In the following days, I began cleaning the fridge, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. I removed each item gently, as if disturbing a shrine. I threw out what had spoiled. I wiped down the shelves with warm water and vinegar the way she used to. I replaced the baking soda box, dated it with a marker. I lined the drawers with new paper towels. I didn't fill it. I bought what I needed. Nothing more. A carton of eggs, a small jug of milk, butter, apples. I arranged them with too much space between, unsure of how to organize anything without her logic. The fridge still looked mostly empty, but it no longer felt abandoned. It felt paused. One afternoon, I found her recipe cards in the drawer beneath the microwave. Dozens of them, handwritten, organized by type. Soups, casseroles, breads, desserts. I flipped through them like sacred texts. Each one carried notes in the margins. Too salty last time. Add more garlic. Raymond loved this one. I held that card against my chest and stood there until the kettle whistled. I didn't become a cook. I didn't try to recreate her rhythm. But once a week, I chose a recipe and followed it as best I could. I made a mess. I burned things. I misread measurements. But I was trying, not to replace her, but to invite her into the silence. The fridge became less of a monument and more of a companion. It hummed. It clicked. It released bursts of cold air when opened. I began to welcome those small sounds. I began to live with them. Sometimes, late at night, I would open the door just to see the light spill out onto the floor. It reminded me that something in the house was still working, still alive, still glowing, even in the empty spaces, even in the quiet. It started with the cassette I'd found in the attic. After I listened to it once, just once, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Her voice, preserved like a pressed flower in the magnetic coils of plastic, had sounded both distant and intimate. I'd never heard that specific recording before. It was her humming, soft and warm, unguarded, not meant for anyone's ears, but her own. I didn't know when she'd recorded it or why, but that didn't matter. It existed. That was enough. After that, I began to look for more. The old tape recorder I'd found still worked, though the battery door had to be held shut with a rubber band. It sat now on the kitchen table, surrounded by a growing collection of unlabeled cassettes I unearthed from drawers, boxes, and forgotten corners of closets. Some were blank. Some had radio shows from decades past. But occasionally, when I pressed play, I'd hear her. Not just her humming, but her voice. Speaking. One tape began with the sound of rain tapping on the windowsill. Then her voice came in, clearer than I expected. She was reading a story aloud, probably for our son, her tone playful and rising at the end of sentences. There was a pause where she must have turned the page, then a small laugh, hers unmistakable, low and slightly raspy, the way it always was in the morning. I sat with my eyes closed and listened to the entire thing, holding the recorder in both hands as though I might warm it like a fragile animal. Afterward, I didn't move. I let the silence fill the space where her voice had just been, and for a moment, I felt like I had been visited. It became a ritual. Each day, usually after my walk or after dinner, I would choose one tape, insert it slowly into the machine, and press play. I never rushed it. I handled each one like a relic. I cleaned the heads of the recorder with cotton swabs. I organized the cassettes in a shoebox by color or by handwriting, depending on what little labeling there was. Some were barely audible. Others were nothing but static. A few had been recorded over. Once I heard my own voice, 20 or 30 years younger, leaving a message for her on the answering machine. I sounded tired, probably calling from work. I told her I'd be late. I told her not to wait up. I heard her voice right after that, saying she loved me, softly, like a reflex. That one I listened to 3 times in a row. I found a small tape labeled Christmas 1995. I remembered that year, vaguely. The year the snow came early and the power went out for 3 days. On the tape, I heard laughter, our son's voice as a teenager, her scolding the dog gently, the clink of dishes, the rustling of gift wrap, and beneath it all, her voice narrating bits and pieces, not knowing she was being recorded. Look at him. He always tears the paper so slowly. That's my mother's old casserole dish. Raymond made the fire too big again. I smiled at that. I could picture her standing there with the camcorder, capturing life without any sense of performance. I didn't realize how many tapes we had collected. They were scattered through years, not in any order, but each one felt like a doorway to a version of her I thought I had forgotten. A soundscape of memory. Proof of her life in a world that moved on without asking. One night I came across a tape that simply said April. I didn't know which year. I played it, and for several seconds there was silence. Then I heard her breathing, then her voice, low and hesitant. If you're listening to this, I'm probably cleaning again, she said. I've got the windows open. It's too early in the season, but I needed fresh air. The daffodils are starting to push up, even though there was frost last night. Her voice faltered, then steadied. Raymond is still sleeping. He deserves to sleep. He works too hard. A long pause. I don't know why I'm talking to this thing. Maybe I just like the idea of being heard when no one's around. I paused the tape. I couldn't go on right away. I held the recorder against my chest and sat in the stillness. The air felt heavier in the room. I hadn't heard that tape before. Maybe she hadn't meant for anyone to hear it. Maybe that was why it had no date, no title. But I was grateful for it. I was starving for her voice, and now that I had it, I couldn't let go. Eventually, I began transferring the audio to my computer. I bought a small converter cable and figured out the software. I wasn't a tech person, but I learned. I created folders with names like Kitchen, Bedtime Stories, Conversations, and Unknown. I cataloged each recording, labeled them with care, noted timestamps where her voice appeared. It gave me purpose. It gave my days structure. Sometimes I would play them at night, letting her voice fill the rooms again. I left them running softly in the background while I cooked, while I ate, while I cleaned. Her laughter would echo down the hallway. Her humming would drift into the living room. It was like living in a house with her shadow. I found another tape, one that made my hands shake as I held it. No label, no markings. I pressed play. At first, nothing. Then her voice, tired, quiet. Today was hard. I don't know why I'm recording this. Maybe I just needed to say it out loud. Sometimes I feel like I'm fading into the wallpaper. Raymond doesn't mean to ignore me. He's just tired, too. We're both tired. But I wish he would notice when I fold his shirts the way he likes, or when I leave the light on in the den so it feels warmer when he comes in. I stopped the tape. I sat with that. I thought I had seen her, understood her, known her in every shade. But there were colors I had missed, regrets I had never heard, soft pleas that lived only in plastic, wrapped in time. I returned to the table and pressed play again. Her voice continued. I'm not unhappy. I love him. I do. I just want to feel remembered. And there it was. That word. Remembered. The same word the little girl had said at the cemetery when asking about the stones. That night I sat at the table with the recorder in front of me. I looked out the window at the dark street, the porch light flickering slightly. And I promised her, wherever she was, however far, that she would be remembered, in her laughter, in her humming, in the voice that lived on in forgotten recordings, and in me. One morning, before the sun had risen high enough to warm the frost off the grass, I sat at the kitchen table and began to write a letter. I didn't plan it. My hands moved before my mind had caught up. There was an old notepad tucked in the drawer where she used to keep coupons and spare keys, the top page already slightly curled from age. I tore it free, grabbed a pen, and just started. Not because I had anything specific to say, not because I expected anyone to read it. I just knew there were things inside me that had no other place to go. The first few lines were stiff, mechanical. Benjamin, I hope you're doing well. Words we say when we don't know what else to say. I scratched them out and started again. Dear son, I wrote and paused. The ink bled slightly into the fibers of the paper, and I watched it, oddly fascinated by how fast a mark becomes permanent. I kept going, not thinking too hard, not editing as I went. I told him I had been walking to the cemetery every morning. I told him about the stones I left, about how they formed a small spiral now, like the tail of a quiet storm. I told him about the soup, about the apple I couldn't throw away, about the way the fridge hummed louder in the absence of her voice. I didn't accuse him. I didn't even name what he had done by not coming. I just described the house, the quiet of it, the weight of it. I wrote for over an hour. I stopped only when my hand began to cramp, when the lines on the page started to blur, because I was looking through something, not at it. I didn't reread what I had written. I folded the pages neatly and placed them in an envelope I found in the back of the drawer. No address, no stamp, just a sealed letter with his name written in my hand. I set it aside. The next day, I wrote another. This one wasn't to him. It was to her. Marjorie, I began. Her name looked strange on the page. I rarely wrote it. I hadn't needed to. It had always lived in my mouth, not my hand. I told her I had found the tapes, that I had heard her singing again, that she was right. The daffodils had come early this year, pushing through the frozen soil with a kind of stubborn hope. I told her I had failed to see certain things, that I wished I had asked more questions, paid more attention, that I didn't know she sometimes felt invisible, that I didn't know she'd left parts of herself scattered throughout this house like breadcrumbs for me to follow. That letter took longer. By the end of the week, there were 6 letters, none mailed, none intended to be. I kept them in a box that once held her sewing patterns. I replaced the thimble and measuring tape with folded envelopes. It felt like I was trading one kind of stitch for another, thread replaced by ink, fabric replaced by memory. Some letters were only a paragraph long. Others went on for pages. One was just a list of things I missed: the sound of her feet on the stairs, the scent of her hand lotion, the way she always used too many napkins at dinner, how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was reading. I didn't censor myself. I didn't try to make the words elegant or useful. They were mine, raw, bent, sometimes incoherent. One letter I tore up immediately after writing it. It was too angry, not at her, at myself, at the passage of time, at how easily life slips into routine until it's too late to ask what the routine was hiding. I didn't want that letter to remain. I burned it in the sink and watched the ash spiral down the drain. After that, I started placing a small flat stone on top of the letter stack each morning, like I did at the cemetery. It grounded them. It gave them weight, gave them shape. If I had believed in rituals before, I didn't remember. But now I needed them. I began to read some of the older letters aloud, softly, not for an audience, just to hear the words form in the air. There was something different about speaking them. They stopped being thoughts and became presence. Echo, like lighting a candle in a dark room, not for light, but for company. One night I found myself writing a letter to myself. I didn't mean to. I started with Dear Dad, and didn't realize until the second paragraph that I was addressing a version of myself from 20 years ago. I told him to pay attention, to slow down, to look at her more closely, to record her voice not because you're afraid to lose it, but because it's beautiful. I told him to call his son more often, to be a little softer, a little less certain. I placed that letter at the bottom of the stack. By the middle of the month, I had filled nearly an entire notebook. I wasn't sure what I was doing. It didn't feel like journaling. It didn't feel like confession. It felt more like excavation, like I was digging through layers of time, memory, guilt, and love, trying to find something that could still grow. One morning, I walked out to the mailbox with one of the letters in my hand. It was addressed to Benjamin. I stood there, the metal box open, the envelope resting in my palm. I thought about placing it inside. I thought about the sound it would make when I let it go, the flap of paper hitting metal. I imagined him reading it, frowning, folding it back up without finishing. I closed the mailbox and carried the letter back inside. I didn't need him to read it. I needed to write it. There was no return address, no recipient's address, just a name, written in my handwriting, just proof that I had tried to speak, that I hadn't let silence be the only answer. That night, I placed the letter in the box with the others and sealed the lid, and for the first time in weeks, I slept without dreaming. It was late on a Wednesday afternoon when I finally opened the file cabinet in the spare room. The room had always been hers. She called it the office, but it was more of a sanctuary, a small quiet space filled with fabric swatches, old birthday cards, clipped recipes, and the ever-growing stack of utility bills filed with precision that only she maintained. I used to tease her about keeping receipts from 20 years ago, but now, standing in the doorway, I was grateful for her obsession with order. The air in the room smelled faintly of paper and lavender. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting in a narrow ribbon of light that cut across the floor and spilled onto the desk. The chair was pushed in, as if waiting for her return. I walked across the room and opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. It stuck a little. I had to wiggle it loose. The metal groaned like it hadn't moved in months, maybe years. Inside were folders, labeled, tabbed, stacked so neatly it made my chest tighten. One was marked Home, 2006-2013. Another Health Prescriptions, and then Final Expenses. It was in her handwriting, the letters small, tight, tilted slightly to the right. She always used a blue pen. I pulled it out and sat on the edge of the bed with the folder in my lap. It was thin, but heavy in meaning. Inside, I found estimates from funeral homes, brochures for burial plots, price lists for cremation services. Each one had notes in the margins. She had circled numbers, written questions, even highlighted one phrase in pink. Transportation of remains included. I hadn't known she'd done this. There were also savings documents, bank statements from a separate account I hadn't touched. It was under her name, but listed the two of us as co-owners. I flipped through the statements, my eyes scanning the monthly balances. She had been putting away money for years, small deposits, regular, almost unnoticed, like breadcrumbs dropped over time. There was enough in there to cover everything. I remembered the day of her funeral. The invoice had come by email. I had paid it from my checking account. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I just wanted things handled. I never checked the details, never thought to ask who was supposed to pay. But now, sitting there with the folder open on my knees, I realized that the account hadn't been touched. She had prepared for it, and Benjamin had known. I went to the computer and pulled up my email. I searched for the message from the funeral home. It was still there, time-stamped for the afternoon, 2 days after she passed. There was a PDF attached. Invoice statement confirmed. I opened it. The line items were listed clearly. Casket, services embalming, cemetery transfer, floral arrangements, printed programs. At the bottom, there was a field labeled Responsible Party. It read, Benjamin Harper. I stared at the screen, reading the name over and over. I hadn't noticed it before. No one had contacted me for payment. No one had asked for authorization. And yet, it was my credit card that had been charged. I checked my statements. The transaction was there, posted the same day the invoice was issued. But from my account. He had listed himself, but let me pay. I sat back in the chair, breathing slowly. I checked the funeral home's website. There was a client portal. I guessed the password. It wasn't hard. His birthday. The same numbers he used for everything since he was a teenager. Inside the portal, I found correspondence. Emails from his address. Please process quickly. My father is elderly. We'll sort the finances later. And then silence. No follow-up. No reimbursement. I stood from the desk and paced the room. My hands were shaking, not with rage, but with something colder, a kind of disbelief that made the air feel thick in my lungs. I remembered his voice on the phone, calm, polite. We won't be able to make it, Dad. Flights were booked. I'm sure you understand. I had understood, or at least I'd pretended to. I returned to the file and kept reading. In the back, she had left a note. Folded. Simple paper. One line. I don't want Benjamin to worry about money. This should make it easier. I sat with that for a long time. Easier. That was always her way. She softened everything. Even his distance. Even his choices. I didn't blame her, but I couldn't stop the questions from forming. What had he known? What had he decided before I even had a chance to catch my breath? I went into the living room and found the cardboard box where I had stored the letters. I opened it and pulled out the one addressed to Benjamin. I added a sentence to the end. You could have told me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat in the chair beside the window and watched the shadows lengthen across the floor. Later I checked the mailbox. There was a postcard from him. Florida. A picture of a beach. Generic handwriting on the back. Hope you're doing okay. Weather's great here. Talk soon. No signature. Just his name printed in the top corner like an afterthought. I placed the postcard face down on the kitchen table. That night, I pulled out an old notebook from the drawer and began to write again. This time, it wasn't a letter. It was a record, a list, expenses paid, notes on the tapes I had found, stone patterns at the grave, recipes she had written, little traces, the map of a life that deserved more than silence. I wrote until my hand hurt, until the house felt full again, until the edges of the page blurred from the weight of things that had no price. It began with a sound, not a voice or a memory, but a mechanical chime. I had been standing in line at the grocery store, watching the conveyor belt inch forward, when the store's overhead speaker chimed with the soft alert that came before announcements. I barely noticed it at first, some blurb about a sale on canned goods, but something in the cadence of the system, the static pop before the voice came through, sent a ripple down my spine. It reminded me of something. More precisely, it reminded me of what a voice could do when it came from nowhere, from above, from everywhere. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the tape recorder in front of me. I had spent weeks collecting her voice, archiving the fragments of laughter, humming, reading, mumbling to herself while folding laundry or peeling carrots. I had transferred every viable moment to digital files, but the cassettes still held a weight that the digital versions didn't. They were objects, tangible, evidence that she had once spoken, once existed in the very air of this house. A strange idea had started forming in the back of my mind, fragile and absurd. But it grew stronger with each night I spent listening to her. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want confrontation. But I wanted him to hear her. I wanted him to be caught off guard by her presence, the way I was caught off guard every time her voice flickered through the silence of my home. I didn't know how to begin, so I started with a name. Lewis Hammond. He was the son of a man I had once worked with. Back when I was still employed at the district's transportation department, his father had been the dispatcher. Lewis had been a teenager then, always hanging around the office after school, eager to help, poking his nose into wires and cords. He was good with machines, smarter than most. I remembered someone mentioning years later that he had taken a job with the Regional Airport Authority, running internal communications and signage systems. I found him online, a LinkedIn profile, still in town, still working at the airport. It felt insane even reaching out. I wrote him an email, nothing detailed, just an old man asking for a favor. I told him who I was, that I remembered his father, that I had a personal message I wanted played over the intercom system, one that wasn't long, wouldn't cause disruption, wouldn't break any rules. I told him I didn't need a response unless it was a yes. He wrote back within a day. I remember you. I remember your wife brought cookies to the garage that Christmas when my dad had the flu. I'll do it. No questions, no negotiation, just yes. That night, I began piecing it together. I sat with my laptop, headphones on, scrubbing through audio files until I found the parts that still made the back of my neck tighten. Her voice saying his name. Her voice saying, "Are you listening?" Her voice saying, "It's time to come home." None of it was scripted. She hadn't meant for them to be used, but they were real. I spent the next 3 days editing, cutting, reordering, making sure the audio was clean. I removed background noise, filtered out static, trimmed dead space. I layered in just enough silence between each line to make the message feel alive. Not rushed, not stitched, just present. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't talk to Benjamin. I didn't write about it in the letters. This was between her and me, and him. Once it was ready, I sent the file to Lewis with a single sentence. "Play this at Terminal B, 10 minutes before Flight 682 to Tampa." He replied, "Understood." That was all. The next step was timing. I had to know when Benjamin was flying. I hadn't spoken to him in weeks, but I still had access to our shared airline rewards account. Years ago, when she was still alive and optimistic about family vacations, she had linked us all under one profile. I logged in. His reservation was there. Flight 682, non-stop, departing Tuesday morning. Terminal B. I wrote it down on the same page where I'd been tracking stone placements at the cemetery. I planned to be there, not to confront him, not even to be seen, just to witness the moment when she would exist again, not in memory, not in paper, but in space, in air, in vibration. I picked out clothes that didn't make me stand out. A gray jacket, slacks without pleats, a ball cap he wouldn't recognize. I knew he wouldn't expect to see me there. He didn't expect me anywhere anymore. I charged the old tape recorder one last time, even though I didn't need it. It felt right to carry it with me. A totem, a reminder of where it had all started. The morning of the flight, I woke before dawn. I made tea, sat at the table, listened one more time to her voice on the file. Benjamin. Pause. Are you listening? Pause. I'm still here. Pause. It's time to come home. I closed the file and placed the flash drive in a drawer. I didn't know what he would feel. I didn't even know what I hoped he'd feel. Maybe guilt, maybe sorrow, maybe nothing. But it didn't matter. The purpose wasn't to punish him. It was to remind him that she had existed, that she had loved him, that her voice still lived in the very air he tried so hard to ignore, and that someone had remembered. I arrived at the airport long before I needed to. The sky was still dark, a dull charcoal smeared with streaks of early light along the horizon. I parked far from the terminal, not in long-term parking, but on the edge of the employee lot where I used to drop Marjorie off when she traveled for work years ago. She didn't fly often, but when she did, she insisted on arriving early, always early. She liked to watch people, said it calmed her, said it reminded her that the world was still moving, even when ours felt still. I walked slowly toward the building, adjusting the hat low over my brow. The sliding doors opened with a soft mechanical sigh, and the familiar scent of recycled air, coffee, and industrial soap hit me. I hadn't stepped into an airport since her last trip. A family wedding in Oregon, I think. She had brought back a pine cone from the forest and kept it on the windowsill in the bathroom. I still hadn't thrown it out. The terminal was already buzzing, rolling suitcases, small children dragging stuffed animals, businessmen with eyes glazed from early meetings. I moved carefully, without drawing attention, avoiding direct gazes. My body moved slower than it used to, but I still remembered the way through this place. I didn't need to check the flight boards. I knew exactly where he would be. Terminal B, Gate 22, Flight 682. I took the elevator up to the observation deck first. I wanted to see the planes. There was something about their size and silence from that distance that gave them a kind of grace. I stood behind the glass and watched one aircraft taxi along the edge of the tarmac, a procession of blinking lights gliding through the morning fog. The windows of the plane looked like eyes half-lidded in sleep, and I wondered how many people inside had no idea that someone was thinking of them from the ground. I stayed there for almost an hour, my hands in my pockets, my feet rooted to the carpet. I didn't feel cold. I didn't feel nervous. I felt prepared. When it was time, I rode the escalator down to the main level and made my way toward the gate. I didn't go all the way to 22. I stopped near the adjacent seating area between gates 18 and 19, where I had a clear view of the boarding lane. I sat in a chair near the wall, facing slightly away, just enough to keep him in sight without being obvious. I didn't have to wait long. He arrived with his wife. She wore a cardigan too light for the weather and carried a designer tote slung over her shoulder. He rolled a sleek black suitcase and kept checking his phone. They looked clean, polished, prepared for vacation. She smiled. He didn't. Not once. Not even when she leaned against his arm and whispered something that made her laugh. I watched them settle near the gate. He sat 2 chairs away from her, scrolling. She took out a magazine. Neither looked up when a mother with a crying baby passed. Neither acknowledged the gate agent's announcements. I checked my watch. 10 minutes until boarding. The airport PA system had its own rhythm. It cycled through pre-recorded boarding messages, security reminders, lost item alerts. And then, with a soft pop and chime, it went quiet. Her voice followed. At first it was low, clear, calm. Benjamin. I saw him freeze. The sound came from everywhere. It echoed across the terminal, weaving between conversations and coffee cups and rolling bags. People glanced up, puzzled. Travelers paused. Some tilted their heads, unsure what they'd heard. "Are you listening?" He looked around, slowly, eyes scanning, confused. "I'm still here." I could see the confusion shift. It moved from curiosity to something heavier. Recognition, maybe, or disbelief. "It's time to come home." Silence followed. A vacuum. No one moved for a moment. Then the terminal resumed its motion. Gate agents returned to their microphones. Families resumed their conversations. The hum of travel resumed. But he stayed still. His wife touched his arm, asking something with her eyes. He shook his head, closed his phone, stood abruptly and walked toward the window, away from her. I remained in my seat, heart steady, hands resting on my knees. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt the quiet closing of a loop, a circle drawn fully. He stood with his back to her, hands in his pockets, staring out at the tarmac. I watched his shoulders rise and fall. I watched the silence around him expand. And I knew he had heard her. Not just the recording, not just the words. He had heard her. After a few minutes, he returned to his seat. He didn't say anything. He didn't touch her hand. He stared forward. I waited until they began to board. I watched him pass through the line. I watched him pause just before handing over his ticket, turning slightly, as if expecting someone to be standing behind him. No one was. He handed over the boarding pass and walked down the jetway. I stood and made my way toward the exit. I didn't look back. Outside, the air had warmed slightly. The sky had opened into soft blue. I took the long way back to my car, moving slowly, hands in my pockets, the memory of her voice still echoing faintly, not from a speaker, but from somewhere deeper. And I knew then that the runway hadn't been for him. It had been for me. The voice stayed with me long after I left the airport. Not hers exactly, not the recording, but the echo of it, the way it had filled the air, the way it had paused the world for a breath, the way it had cut through the noise of departure boards and travel plans and gate announcements. It hadn't sounded like a ghost. It hadn't sounded like a trick. It had sounded like her, entirely and unquestionably her. I drove home slowly, the road still half empty from the early morning. Trees blurred past the windows, houses with their lights off, mailboxes quiet. Every turn of the wheel felt deliberate. Every blink of the indicator seemed slower than it should have been. I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting in my lap, fingers twitching slightly, as if I was still holding something fragile. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as I'd left it, familiar and unmoved, but it felt different. The air around it seemed gentler, not warmer, not lighter, just present, as if something that had gone missing had found its way back and didn't want to make a scene about it. I sat in the car for a few more minutes, engine off, key still in the ignition. The sun was rising fast now, flooding the windshield with streaks of light. The warmth crept up my arm, touched the side of my face. I closed my eyes and let it rest there. Inside, everything was still in its place. The chair by the window, The notebook on the kitchen table, the mug I hadn't washed, the box of tapes on the floor beside the couch. I kicked off my shoes and stood in the living room, not moving, just listening. The silence was different now, not emptier, not louder, just different. I walked to the kitchen and turned on the kettle. The sound of water rushing into the metal bottom, the click of the burner, the growing hum. It all settled me. I moved through the small routine without thinking, muscle memory guiding me from cabinet to drawer to cup. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need to. After the tea steeped, I sat at the table and reached for one of the letters I hadn't touched in weeks. It was the first one I'd written to Benjamin. I opened it, slowly, carefully, like it might crumble. I read the words in silence, line by line. The sentences were rough, uneven. There was hurt in them, not anger, just weight. I saw how I had been trying to shape grief into something readable, something understandable. But now it felt unnecessary. He had heard her. Whatever was left unsaid between us would stay unsaid, and I was learning to live with that. After I refolded the letter, I took the recorder from the table and placed it in my lap. It still had one tape in it, the first one I'd found in the attic, the one with her humming. I pressed play, and the soft static filled the room, followed by that familiar breath, that hum that swelled and fell in waves. She had never meant it for anyone else. She had recorded it alone, maybe while cleaning, maybe just to keep her hands busy. But now it lived in my ears, in my walls, in the corners of every room she had once stood in. As the tape played, I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. I wasn't chasing memory anymore. I wasn't searching for moments to hold on to. I was simply letting her exist. I imagined her voice moving through the house, brushing past curtains, settling into cushions, rising with the kettle's steam, not haunting it, not echoing it, just being part of it again. At some point I drifted into sleep, still sitting in the chair, the recorder still playing its slow, broken loop. I woke to the click of the tape ending, that soft, final pop that meant there was no more sound left to give. I rewound it and played it again, and again. It was no longer about remembering. It was about being with. Later that afternoon, I walked to the mailbox and found nothing but flyers and a cable bill. I carried them inside, tossed them onto the counter, and opened the back door instead. The air was crisp, still holding on to winter, but the ground was softening. The trees were bare, but the soil smelled alive. I sat on the steps and let the sun settle into my shoulders. I could hear birds somewhere in the distance, a dog barking, a plane overhead, and underneath it all, quieter than breath, I could still hear her voice. Not in the sky, not in the tape, in me. I heard it when I picked up a spoon, when I folded a towel, when I rinsed a dish, when I leaned my weight against the banister at the top of the stairs. Her voice had seeped into the things she touched, and I was one of them. That night I didn't play the tape. I didn't light a candle. I didn't write a letter. I just sat in the living room with the lights off and listened to the house. It had learned her rhythm, and now, so had I. It had rained the night before. I knew by the smell. That earthy, swollen scent of damp ground, of sidewalks still drying in the sun's early stretch. I opened the front door and stood on the porch for a long while, watching the water retreat slowly into the seams of the world. The grass glistened. The gutter still dripped. Somewhere a neighbor's sprinkler was hissing, late for its usual schedule. Everything felt slowed down, not paused, just quieter. Like the earth had taken a deep breath and wasn't ready to let it out yet. Inside, the house remained unchanged. The chair still faced the window. The tapes were neatly boxed. The notebook was closed but not forgotten. The refrigerator hummed steadily. The silence no longer clawed at me the way it used to. It had grown familiar, like a companion who didn't need to speak to be heard. I didn't feel at odds with it anymore. I moved with it, through it. I boiled water for tea without thinking, then poured it, let it steep, and carried it into the living room. I sat in my chair, not hers, and let the cup warm my palms. I didn't look at the clock. I didn't check the date. I knew what day it was, and that was enough. 3 days had passed since the airport. He hadn't called. I hadn't expected him to. I hadn't needed him to. What I had done wasn't meant for thanks or apology or even recognition. It was for truth, for memory, for her, and maybe, in some small way, for me. Still, I kept listening for something. Not the phone, not the doorbell, something deeper. I listened to the space between moments, the beat between the radiator's clicks, the silence after the stove settled. I listened for what the world does after you stop trying to shape it. That afternoon, I walked to the cemetery. I hadn't planned to, but my feet carried me there anyway. The path was still familiar. My usual stones had started to scatter, some sunk into the soil, others moved by wind or small animals. I didn't rearrange them. They were where they needed to be. Her grave was quiet. No new flowers. The laminated prayer card was gone, probably lifted by the wind. The grass had grown in thicker around the edges of the stone. I crouched slowly, knees stiff, and touched the granite with my fingertips. I didn't speak. I just sat with her, the way I would have on a Sunday afternoon when she read, and I dozed off beside her. A small breeze passed through the trees. That was her answer. I stayed for over an hour. Let the sun move behind me. Let the shadow of her stone stretch across the lawn. Then I stood and walked home. When I got back, there was a letter waiting in the mailbox. No return address, just my name, in handwriting that was unfamiliar. I brought it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it for a long while before opening it. It was from his wife, a single page. She said she didn't know what I had done, or why, but that it had shaken him. She said he hadn't spoken much since the flight. He had spent the entire first day of their trip alone on the balcony, listening to an old voicemail of his mother, over and over again. She said he had cried, really cried, not the kind of crying people do in movies or in front of other people, the kind that comes from the core of something unhealed. She said he couldn't bring himself to call me yet, that he didn't have the words. She said, "Thank you for reminding him." I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer where I had once kept her grocery lists. Then I went outside, walked to the backyard, and sat on the small wooden bench beneath the tree we had planted on our 25th anniversary. The branches had filled out. The bark had thickened. It had taken longer than expected to bloom, but it had bloomed just the same. I sat there and listened again. Not for birds, not for wind, but for stillness. The stillness that follows action, the quiet that settles after a chord has been struck, and the vibration fades into memory. The kind of silence that doesn't ache, but affirms. The silence of reckoning. I didn't need his call. I didn't need his apology. I had delivered something heavier than confrontation. I had carried her voice into the space where his noise used to be. And now he would carry it too. That was all the closure I would ever ask for. That evening, as the sky burned low in the west, I made myself a simple dinner. Toast, eggs, black tea. I ate slowly, with both hands resting on the table. I cleared my plate, washed it, dried it, set it back on the rack. The routines mattered again. Later, I sat in her chair. For the first time, it didn't feel like intrusion. It felt like permission. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't put on the tape. I just sat there and let the weight of everything settle into my body, like gravity finally remembered where to rest. The silence was whole, not hollow, and in that stillness, I knew that something had shifted, not loudly, but permanently.